Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
I'm not sure why these threads exist. It seems like all Skinwalker Goatman stories are basically the same, but I guess I might as well contribute my own story. So there's this abandoned old oil rig in the woods right down the road from my house. My buddy David showed it to me when we were in high school. We used to go back there with a few other dudes to smoke some weed without having to worry about being caught. He said it was part of his dad's property, and that he used to play back there all the time when he was a kid, and that it was perfectly safe. David was also a compulsive liar, and would lie about the stupidest shit just to see if he could get away with it. Anyway, he told me and my two buddies, Chris and Kyle, that we could use it whenever we wanted. Fast forward a handful of years. This story takes place a couple of years ago when my buddies and I were in college. We don't really talk to David anymore. In fact, we're pretty sure he has moved out of the state, but we hadn't spoken to him in so long that we weren't sure. Either way, we continue to use his little oil rig spot, because at this point, it's just a peaceful, comfortable, and quiet place to chill for a couple of hours and just shoot the shit. Chris was usually the one driving, and I was always shotgun. It was getting pretty late on this particular evening. We usually leave before it gets dark, because the woods in this area are creepy as shit. But we had all been drinking for a while, and Chris wanted to wait it out for another 40 minutes before he drove anywhere. We all decided to step outside of his car for a cigarette, and this is when shit started getting weird. We were all talking about one of Kyle's past girlfriends and teasing him, and then we heard this sound. We all heard it, but at this point we couldn't really tell you what it was or even what it sounded like, because we were all laughing when we heard it. It was just loud enough for us to barely hear it. Kyle must have heard it better than Chris and I, because as soon as it registered, he had tossed his cigarette and noped back into the car. Chris and I just stood staring off into the woods to see if we could hear it a little better. Unfortunately, we did. So this sound, this awful sound, it sounded like a smallish or medium-sized dog at first. For a split second, it was actually kind of comforting. I think Chris and I were both worried that we might be about to learn the hard way that David was full of shit about this being his dad's property. The comforting feeling didn't last very long, though. The howling sound quickly went from a howling sound to a growling sound, and then from a growling sound to this horrible, deep gurgling sound. It wasn't something any native animal could make under normal circumstances. It sounded kind of like a koala growl, only a little bit wetter, if that makes any sense. I still didn't know what that sound was, but I was 90% sure that either monsters were real or I just heard an animal get murdered. Either way, that's when I noped back into the car. Chris, of course, didn't think anything of it. He laughed at us and teased us from outside the car, making your standard generic boogeyman jokes. He tells us that it was probably just David being an asshole, that we were just mistaken about him moving away. Chris is the kind of person who thinks he's a little smarter than he actually is. I don't know if it's because he wanted to prove to us that it wasn't a monster, or if he is just an idiot, but he went off to look for the source of the sound. I tried to reason with him, saying that it may not have been anything paranormal, but it could have very well been a psycho or a pissed animal or some shit. But he went off anyway. So Chris had been gone for about 5 minutes before Kyle and I started to get worried. 5 minutes isn't a long time, but he should have been back by then. He could have gone up to David's old house, knocked on his door, and wrestled David back down to the car in that amount of time. After 10 minutes of texting and calling with no response, we decided we're going to go look for him. We both get out of the car, and sure enough, there's Chris, just kind of standing there beside the oil rig itself. It was dark, so I guess we didn't notice him while we were in the car. So Kyle and I are feeling mixed emotions. We're glad to see him, but we're pissed that he was gone for so long. We bombard him with questions like what happened, what did he find, what took him so long, etc. Most of our questions were met with shrugs or stares, although we were able to get him to answer a few questions. But they didn't say much. He just told us that he got lost and that he didn't hear his phone. Whatever. At this point, all Kyle and I want to do is go home. But Chris wanted to keep looking around in the woods and was trying to get me to go with him. I assumed because he knew that I'm used to navigating the woods. We stood around for ages, just arguing and begging him to take us back home. And the more we talked, the more uncomfortable Kyle and I were getting. There's something not right about Chris. He's usually an incredibly predictable person, but right now he's different. He's talking differently. Like the tone of his voice is scratchier than usual, and the things he is saying are downright strange. He's coming up with the weirdest imaginable reasons as to why we should explore the woods. Things like asking us if we needed to use the restroom, or if we wanted to see a dead animal, or something stupid that he found in the woods. It was at this point that I decided I was just going to walk home, and I texted Kyle about how Chris was being weird and that we needed to ditch him and go back to my place. He agreed, so we agreed to follow him into the woods and lag behind him as much as possible. The woods were pretty thick, and it was almost pitch black, so it wasn't difficult to lose him and get back out onto the main road. Halfway during the walk back to my house, Chris calls me asking where the hell we went. I told him he was being creepy, so we left. Needless to say, he had no idea what we were talking about. And that's about it. He dropped by my place and we continued drinking there. We argued about it for like 10 minutes. He insisted that we elaborate on how he was being creepy. We gave him examples, and he told us to shut the F up. You're full of shit. You're just trying to scare me. It's not going to work, etc. We eventually just had to drop it, because he was starting to get legitimately pissed, because he thought the joke had been going on for too long. Every now and then I'll hear that noise when I go out for a smoke. I'd say 2 or 3 times a year. The sound is far enough away that it doesn't scare me enough to not finish my cigarette. But it's enough for me to keep my front door cracked while I stand out on the porch, in case I have to get back inside quickly. As for the sound itself, I've heard it enough times that I'm almost positive that it's an animal being killed, which eases my nerves. But I still can't think of any real explanation. We don't have any real predator animals over here, not ones that would prey on dogs. Maybe coyotes fighting or something. If someone has a legitimate explanation for it, I would like to hear it.
Has anybody entertained the possibility that these things might be forced hallucination? An interesting common theme is the smell. This could easily be an agent used to manipulate the mind. It could be something hoping to drug us and learn our customs. Maybe the stories come from times when there was some sort of mixture error, and the serum designed to make the mind believe another creature is human, and perhaps ultimately forget the whole experience didn't do its job fully. Or perhaps the person or thing behind the mind manipulation and study was after the specific result of fear, to study the actions and reactions of humans when terrified. Maybe a lot of different and seemingly unrelated creepy things are all real and actually just forced hallucinations for study. It's interesting, we associate malevolence with harm and intent to harm as a direct result of our evolutionary social patterns. Morality grew out of social necessity. It does not exist outside our minds and only exists as a means to protect ourselves and one another from harm. What would make us think a being existing outside of life or death would understand or concern itself with the strictly human notion of morality? It wouldn't understand anger, sadness, love, right and wrong, etc. This is why I give no credence to all the evil spirit stories on here. A creature existing in the 4th dimension, or any greater dimension, cannot experience the things we experience, and it wouldn't make sense if they did.
My father is Navajo, who was raised on the res in northern Arizona. I grew up in Southern California, but grew up going to the res every year. I eventually moved and worked there. I'm not a skinwalker expert by any means, but I'll share what I know. The earliest experience I had was on one of my first solo trips, without my parents, out to our ranch on the reservation. I traveled with my cousin and a few friends. Our ranch is pretty much in the middle of nowhere. The nearest people, being at the very closest, are about 10 miles away, so you're pretty much on your own. On our first night out there, we arrived around 2 a.m. and there was no moon and it was pitch black. We had a hard time finding our hogan, traditional octagon-shaped Navajo house. We decided to just camp near a cattle corral which we found. We set up tents and knocked out until the sun came up. When I woke up, I took a little walk around our campsite and found coyote tracks which encircled our camp and actually got pretty close to the tents and campfire, which was pretty weird, and a bad sign for several reasons. The rest of the day went without incident. We woke up, cooked breakfast, explored the north rim of the Grand Canyon on the reservation side, and checked out old hogans in the area. We stayed up particularly late that night. We had been out exploring at night and four-wheeling on some off-road trails. It was around 2 or 3 a.m. and we were driving on a rocky road that went up into a small canyon, so there were hillsides pretty high and steep on both sides of me. I was standing in the back of the truck with a spotlight. That was when I first saw the light. The best way to describe what I saw was the visual effect of when you're standing in a room and someone behind you takes a picture with a flash. There was a brief instant in which everything lit up behind me, but it was a dull orange-reddish light. I turned around towards where it came from and shined the light around, but there was nothing there whatsoever, just a bunch of rocks. We thought it was weird but kept driving. Once on top of the hill, we stopped to look around and noticed the weird light again, but this time it was far away, at least several miles. It was the same color, but it looked like a muzzle flash from a gun. I waited and waited to hear the gunshot, thinking it was people like us shooting at night, but it never came. Then we saw another flash, but this time it was several miles to the west and a little bit closer. Then another and another, closer and closer, all within a few minutes. We decided it was a little weird and, without talking about it, turned around and went to the hogan this time. We didn't really talk about the lights for some reason, and all settled down in the hogan. There was myself, my cousin, and my 2 bros. We talked for a while, and it was that moment when everyone stopped talking, and everyone was just about to fall asleep when it happened. The door, there's only one door, a small wooden door that locks shut, shook violently as if someone kicked the door as hard as they could. It was loud and strong enough to where you could hear the lock rattle, and the door bounce back and rattle against the wooden frame. My friends shot up in bed and said, "WTF was that?" They had reason to be alarmed. We were very far from anyone else, and they knew that. It's extremely quiet out there, pretty much a deafening silence, and you can hear when vehicles are approaching. I got out of bed, grabbed a shotgun, and told my cousin to get his rifle. I walked to the door, motioned for him to come over, and said, "You go left, I'll go right." I'm not really sure why, but I wasn't scared despite the obvious weirdness of what was going on. I ripped the door open, and we both slipped out the door one after the other and swept the area. Looked everywhere we could, went to the truck, got the spotlight, and swept the area. Nothing. No footprints, no animals, nothing. We decided to send a message and shot some rounds off to scare whatever it was away. I think we were all kind of worried, but eventually we went back into the hogan and settled back in, kind of joking about it to calm our nerves. Eventually they all fell asleep, but I hid my nervousness and my heart was still racing. It wasn't until everyone was quiet and asleep that I noticed the thumping. I heard it very faintly through the rock walls, and when I put my ear to the wall, I heard it a lot better. It was a very rhythmic thumping sound, something very heavy, and timed the same every single thump. It sounded as if it was coming through the rock table that the hogan sits on top of. I tried to rationalize it and told myself it was just the cows, and somehow managed to fall asleep. I woke up the next morning and we went to check the cows, which were about 10 miles away on the ranch and hadn't been anywhere near our hogan that night. Several days later, after I told my aunts about what happened, they told me that one of my Navajo grandmas, who lived alone and out in the middle of nowhere, had a weird thing happen too. The same night we had our door kicked, someone had knocked on her door in the middle of the night. When she opened the door, there was no one there. My aunts think it was a skinwalker who was messing with me and my cousin because we weren't raised on the res. I'm not sure that is the reason why it happened, but I do believe it may have been a skinwalker.
Be making tea. From the counter in the kitchen, I can see all of my garden. Not wide, but long, with a tall wooden fence at the bottom. Used to be sheds there, but have been having a clear out and they're gone, revealing the entire fence with one of the slats missing at about eye level. The fence backs out onto a field my favorite neighbor owns. Looking out over the garden, thinking how creepy it would be if he were to suddenly appear and how much I would shit myself. Pair of eyes appear. It's my neighbor. It's daytime, so I'm not scared after realizing who it was. Favorite neighbor, so instead of ignoring him, finish making tea, go out to say hello to him, with a cup of tea, of course. All the while, he is just staring as I walk down the garden to him. He says nothing, not creeped out, just amused at this point, because he's the type to mess around to get on your nerves. Also, the fact I had my Doberman at my feet made it pretty difficult to be scared. England, so asked whether he'd like a cup of tea when within distance. No reply. Would you like cup of tea? Off tea, he sounds slightly garbled, and I notice his eye has a slight twitch. Yeah, or coffee, I have both. While thinking WTF man you are on the other side of the fence, I was only being polite, you're meant to say no. Cough D. He sounds slightly more coherent, but he's lacking his usual Irish accent. Are you all right? I ask as his head has started twitching a bit to the left, starting to get creeped out. Remember every single thing I've ever read on /x/. Dog at this point is buggered off. Tier? He elongates the vowels monotonously, sounding creepy like sort of robotic. Yeah, anyway, I have to go do stuff now, so I'll see you later. Or coffee? Bye. Walk to house, trying not to run. When I get indoors, I look out the door and he's still standing there. Oh yeah, I ought to point out there was no particular smell. Could have been masked by the rank mud smell. He does have a pond. Couple of hours later, go to the kitchen to make more tea. As I open the door to the kitchen, I glance up. Heart attack mode engage. He's standing there. Jump back and almost fall over. His arm seems to be at a weird angle and he keeps throwing his head and twitching his wrist every now and again. Everything in my body tells me to not open the door and to leave the room and forget he's out there. Instead, stand there, oh my godding for a few minutes. He doesn't go, stands and twitches. After a while of nothing happening, I get sort of hysterical and start laughing madly. Step into the kitchen, grab the thing nearest to me, oven mitts. He's standing at the door and I can sort of hear him through the door, cup of tea, still laughing, crying as well. Go to open the door and he just runs off down the alleyway.
Growing up, I lived in northeastern Arizona, literally about 5 miles south of the Navajo Reservation in Winslow. Naturally, being that close to the reservation, or the res, skinwalkers were a huge topic of conversation amongst the locals, and we all took it very seriously. Stories of personal experiences abounded. I was no different. My family had gone camping in a little spot about 50 miles or so south of town called Hart Canyon, near Wiggins Crossing, if anyone is interested. We had been there all day and I was extremely familiar with the area, as we had camped there 20 or so times before. So my parents let me just wander about alone in the woods. This was back in the early 90s. Anyway, I had some G.I. Joes that I had been playing with in the nearby creek, about 80 yards from our campsite. There were no other campers there with us. My mom had called me back to camp for dinner, so I left and ate. Played around camp for a while and realized that I'd forgotten my toys back at the creek, so I took a flashlight and headed back that way. I knew right where I had left them, so in no time I found them and grabbed them up. As I squatted down to grab them on the edge of the water, a sudden urgency that I'd never felt before ran down my spine. I remember feeling frozen because of the fear, like the little boy on E.T. when the alien comes out of the field for the first time, and he's trying to scream for his family. I looked up and pointed my flashlight to the other side of the creek, and about 10 yards down the way, I saw something. At first I thought it was a deer, but it was standing up, so I thought it may be a bear. But it was too skinny and did not have enough poofy hair. It skunked behind a tree and peered out slightly at me. I seriously was too scared to move. I just read a bit about Bigfoot for the first time since it wasn't really popular in my area. I thought for a long time that that's what I saw.
I finally had seen enough to gather my wits and scramble as fast as I could back to camp. I told my parents and they kind of dismissed it as my imagination, so I just stayed close for the rest of the trip. About 2 years later, I was at my house. I had 2 dogs. They were outside dogs and lived their whole lives in my backyard. One night they went psycho, barking at first at something in the alley behind my house. Then they both started whimpering. I had my window open slightly and one of my dogs straight up jumped up to the window, frantically chewed through the screen of the window, forced its way into the house, and would not leave the house for 3 days. Another time when I was about 13, we used to play night games in the town, mostly there being nothing much else to do. We would walk around our neighborhood and act suspicious so the cops would come chase us around, and we run down the alleyways and hop into random folks' backyards to hide. Now, it was extremely common to see an intoxicated Navajo or Hopi in the alley, so it was no big deal to see one in the alley behind my house that night as we being 2 of my friends and myself, ran from a police car hot on our tail. We saw him plain as day standing in our way. We ran around him and jumped into the nearest yard to hide. We waited for the cop to pass us and hopped back out. Literally about 3 minutes went by. We ran back the way we came, and as we got to the point where the drunk man had been, he was gone. In his place was a coyote sitting there watching us. We ran right past it, feet from it. And anyone who knows coyotes knows they will bail out way before you get close to them. This bugger held his ground and calmly sat and watched us run past him. We all freaked out and stayed inside for a month. My last experience was when I was about 15 or 16. My brother has a girlfriend who lives in a small community south of Winslow called Starlight Pines, about 25 miles-ish. Well, we went to see her one day, and as we drove out, about 15 miles out, we saw a native guy standing on the side of the road. This was quite odd because the res was north of town, and it was rare to see anyone on foot south of town because it's just desert and forest for literally 80 miles. Anyway, we saw this guy. He looked normal enough. Flannel shirt, jeans. We got to our destination and hung out with my brother's girlfriend and her family well into the night when we decided to head back home. Hopped in his truck, a Chevy S10, and drove back the way we came. In the same spot we saw the native dude. He was still there. I remember thinking, that dude is crazy standing out there all day and into the night. What's he doing? Right as we passed him, we heard a loud bang on the back of the truck. At first, I thought we hit an animal, but I hadn't felt anything that we'd run over. I turned around and looked out the back window. My brother started to slow down, thinking there may be something wrong with the truck. In the brake lights, I see the native guy chasing after us. We were easily going 55 to 60 at this point, as we were about to stop. The guy is on the road, feet behind us. I scream at my brother to not stop. Gun it, man, gun it. He does, and being a Chevy S10, it had a speed governor on it at 80 miles. This guy keeps up with us. We are seriously freaking out. I asked my brother, what if we don't make it back to town, or what about when we have to slow down once we get close? After those 2 miles that stretched forever, I looked back and he was gone. We got home, booked it into the house, and told our parents. The next morning, I get up to head somewhere and look at my brother's truck thinking about the night before. I wondered what the loud bang was just before we started getting chased. Inspecting the truck, I found a handprint smeared in the dust from about 2/3 over to the right, then smeared to the right taillight. I never went there again. Sorry, it was so long. But those are my experiences with what I'm convinced were skinwalkers.
My mom shared a strange and creepy experience she and her siblings and parents witnessed when she was younger at around 6 years of age. My mom is a very elegant, classy, prim, and proper woman who would not be the type of person to lie about this just to scare someone. Also, my aunts and uncles have verified this story individually. My grandparents, mother, aunts, and uncles temporarily lived in a small village town in the Chiapas state of Mexico, with a population of about 1,000 people scattered throughout the hilly landscape. They lived at the bottom of one of the larger hills, Cerro, which could take a couple of hours to hike to the very top. My grandparents were relatively poor, my grandfather making just enough to provide for their necessities by working at a sugarcane field. Yet they lived in one of the nicer homes because of its proximity to the hill and an alleged witch house at the top of that hill. Locals stayed away from the house and rent was cheapest there out of all the other much simpler homes available. My grandparents, aunts, uncles, and mom had some paranormal experiences in that home. Most of these were attributed to the witch in typical Mexican folklore fashion. The skinwalker they witnessed, however, was what made them leave. My mom says that one day she was inside at the entrance of the home with the door wide open playing with some toys. My aunts and uncles were in the same room behind her also playing and roughhousing while my grandfather was relaxing on a rocking chair in that room. She happened to look up right as a medium-sized black dog was walking along the road in front of the home. What spooked her was that this dog had two human breasts hanging from its chest that were connected to its skin as though it were a part of its body. She says the breasts were hairless, which allowed her to see that they were not some sort of tumor or growth on the dog. My mom says the dog instantly gave her very bad feelings and she started to cry. This caused the dog to stop in its tracks and look at my mom. My grandfather got up and headed towards the door, as did my aunts and uncles, to see what was happening. He instantly recognized what the creature was and pulled out a small revolver he always carried with him due to the long treks he made on foot to his job. He aimed the revolver and tried pulling the trigger, but the gun kept jamming and would not fire. He tried it multiple times, each time checking and making sure the gun was in proper working order, but it simply would not fire. All the while, the dog was just standing there watching. The dog eventually turned and started running down the road and into some overgrowth along the side of the road. After it disappeared from view, my grandfather tried shooting his gun and it fired without a hitch. Although they were very limited financially, they moved out within a week after the encounter. I wanted to include every detail that my family members provided me with to create the best possible picture of what happened. Unfortunately, both of my grandparents passed when I was really young, so I cannot ask them about this event. I've never heard of a skinwalker partially changing and turning and found this quite interesting. The family believed it was the witch who lived on top of the hill who apparently was also a skinwalker, Nahual.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check the Odyssey and Rumble pages for separate archives of previous broadcasts.